Did anyone else notice that suddenly the 2000s are like 20 years ago? It basically took me until 2014 to properly twig that we were in a new decade, but some people are still stuck in the turn of the millennium. Danger signs that someone is unable to let the 2000s go include taking shots at Twilight as if it's some stupid new thing the kids are into, or complaining that all modern horror movies suck. A statement like that makes me want to actually take up drinking and pour myself a beer just so I can have someone hold it for me. As you see, the 2000s was not the best decade for the horror genre, and actually represented a major step backwards for it.
It's not scary, it's gross. I hate all that torture porn shit.
Aside from the classic Universal monster movies of the olden days, horror films were historically in a ghetto of cheap thrills full of demeaning roles for women, bad effects, and weak attempts at social commentary. More like a carnival ride that only the peasants would get any enjoyment from.
And where, my pet, is Miss Jessel?
The 60s started to change all of that, with pioneering ghost films like The Innocents and The Haunting examining serious topics like mental illness and hysteria, interwoven with the jump scares.
I can't pretend to understand what its purpose is, I only know that it is happening.
Other highbrow horrors proved to be important cultural milestones, or else really successful popcorn entertainment.
I know you're afraid. I'm afraid too.
An independent zombie flick ended up becoming a runaway success and one of the most profitable films of its time. And in 1968, a tale about a woman having Satan's baby got 2 Oscar nominations and 1 win.
What have you done to it? What have you done to its eyes?
The 70s continued this boom period for horror, with independently made productions achieving mainstream success and critical acclaim, with a movie about demonic possession released at Christmas having people queue up down the street to see, and becoming the first horror to get a Best Picture nomination. Seriously, 60s and 70s horror never gets enough praise. The 80s gets all the love, some of it deservedly so, for lots of technical innovations in special effects and makeup, as well as the creations of certain franchises for better or worse. But it also saw the regression of horror being considered cheap, grindhouse trash again.
They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
The 90s saw horror being brought out of this ghetto once again, and becoming far more mainstream, with big studio budgets and scripts full of subversiveness.
This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
The 2000s just brought us remakes. Lots and lots of remakes. While there were plenty of hidden gems that are now being rediscovered, the cycle of inferior remakes and reboots stuck in memory for a lot of people. And it's the 2000s films that reminded people who didn't like horror just why that was. But what about the 2010s?
But you don't give a shit who dies because there's no character development. There's just body parts ripping and blood spewing.
The decade that opened with Scream 4 and The Cabin in the Woods making fun of the sorry state of the horror genre progressed into an explosion of creativity that made it a good time to be a horror fan. From one of the most critically and commercially successful Stephen King adaptations that didn't ignore its horror elements, to Oscars for Best Screenplay and Best Picture, and a whole collection of incredible films that gave us a new kind of storytelling.
I be the witch of the wood.
Liar, liar.
I am.
Outside of film, television delivered too. This era would come to be known as the horror renaissance.
It began as a prank and ended in murder. Fantastic choice.
Fear Street is probably the first significant event movie in the horror genre for the 2020s, although the event itself had to happen entirely online, what with... It was loosely based on a series of RL Stine novels aimed at a slightly older crowd than the more famous Goosebumps books. Adaptation rights were first bought back in the 90s during both series' heyday, but it took so long to get any progress that by the time one got made, the 90s setting was a period piece. The project ended up in the hands of Lee Janiak, who had already made waves in the horror genre with the 2014 film The Honeymoon, and directing episodes of Scream and Outcast.
I didn't want audiences to feel like we were tricking them into a gimmick. I wanted it to feel like it was the reason we were doing the 3 movies is because we had to, because of the story.
Fear Street would be a trilogy of films, shot back to back like the OG game changer in terms of franchise filmmaking. Part 1 would be set in 1994, Part 2 in 1978, and Part 3 taking place half in 1666, and also serving as a conclusion to the 1994 portions.
What we came up with was that we were doing something kind of new, that is like this hybrid between movies and like between traditional television content.
The trilogy's way of storytelling would borrow more from television, particularly the sleeper hit Stranger Things. Fittingly enough, as the creators were both Lee Janiak's husband and brother-in-law, and two cast members would appear in similar roles.
We wanted each movie to feel satisfying and like kind of complete in its own like resolving of the main tension. And then also we wanted to make sure that the narrative that was driving us forward into the third movie was staying compelling and like we were still uncovering new things.
The plan was even for 1978 to be released in cinemas only a month after 1994, and likewise with 1666. But when your scheduled cinema release was June 2020, it was back to the drawing board.
Maybe shit is doomed.
Keeping to a similar plan, the films were released online within a week of each other, and believe it when I say that from the months of July until October, I was obsessed.
Okay, first of all, Stephen King is like super popular.
Roll credits.
Best case is what? Dead on the mall floor after a double shift? Or maybe if you're really lucky, you're the one carrying the knife.
We're given a tour of two neighbouring towns, the prosperous Sunnyvale and the wretched hive Shadyside. The town's residents have hated each other for centuries for a multitude of reasons that boil down to plain old classism.
I am half an hour away. It might as well be the goddamn moon, and you know it.
Dubbed the murder capital of the United States, Shadyside has a history where, every few decades, one resident inexplicably goes mad and kills a bunch of people.
It happens in Shadyside over and over. Normal people turn into psychos.
This dates all the way back to the town's days as a Puritan settlement in the 1600s, when a woman called Sarah Fear was executed for witchcraft, leading to legends that she placed a curse on Shadyside.
All these massacres are connected to Sarah Fear. The witch's curse is real.
Given what kind of movie we're watching, these legends are 94% true, as a group of Shadyside teens find out when one of their friends comes across Sarah Fear's skeleton and bleeds on her bones, which sends all the previous Shadyside killers after them and anyone protecting her. And that's only the first movie.
I placed one of them in the mid-90s because I felt like that was like its own era of slasher. And then 70s was obviously the heyday.
One of the ways in which Lee Janiak wanted each Fear Street film to stand out on its own was to distinguish every entry with its own particular style, and pay tribute to different horror legacies.
Scream for me is maybe, I think it's one of the best movies ever made, period.
The 90s setting in Part 1 is naturally very reminiscent of Scream, and not just because it recreates the opening scene. I'll come back to that. The cinematography resembles a 90s studio slasher like the many bigger budget teen films that followed Scream's success, like I Know What You Did Last Summer and The Faculty, with emphasis on Steadicam and jib shots, and almost never leaving the tripod.
You stole Cobb's gun? Fuck yeah, she did.
The dialogue is also witty and sarcastic, like a Kevin Williamson script, which I'd say is my trash if I didn't think that was the height of screenwriting quality.
Oh my God, Randy, I thought you were dead.
I probably should be. I never thought I'd be so happy to be a virgin.
As well as the love letters to 90s teen slashers, the visual style is just really striking. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that the late 2010s were so saturated in nostalgia for the 80s that, well, even if the 80s were way before my time, I feel like I've basically lived them after 4 seasons of Stranger Things. Fear Street not only refreshingly broke the trend of 80s nostalgia, but it also felt like the first real Stranger Things style love letter to the 90s. I mean, Captain Marvel mostly used the setting as flavouring, and Scream Queens used 90s music in a classic way. But this felt like a real conscious attempt to immerse the viewer in the time period. And like Stranger Things and It 2017, 1994 has the nostalgic lens, but also takes away the proverbial rose-coloured glasses to remind people about the negative parts of an era their memory ignores.
I know you were always too afraid to tell anyone about us.
A 90s kid may remember the music and the fashion, but not how cynical and apathetic Gen X teens actually were, or how it was possible to live openly gay, but doing so automatically made you a social outcast, and passing for straight in the hopes of a quiet life was very common.
There's not much of a future in Shadyside with a lesbo.
And Fear Street's subversiveness is even demonstrated by its opening kill. Obviously, this is a nod to Scream, since Drew Barrymore and Maya Hawke were well-known children of famous acting families, as well as being better known than the rest of the cast. But with its opening scene, Scream spelled out that it was going to break the predictability of the usual slasher formula by killing off one of the biggest names in the cast immediately, and leaving it in doubt who would survive. It also brought slashers away from the supernatural killers like Freddy Krueger, and how Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees ended up, with the unmasking telling us that it was a human killer and turning the story into a whodunit. So in addition to the tension of will they survive, it now adds who is the killer. Fear Street subverts the subversion first by showing the audience who's under the mask right away, setting this up as a supernatural whodunit, and secondly, by killing off the smart, bookish Sidney Prescott/Julie James inspired heroine. Both films kill off the expected survivor as a decoy before introducing the true protagonist.
And I know that douchebag out there was squeezing your ass.
Before we get into the discussion on Dina, who is our main POV character, I feel I should talk about what a risk it is to make the lead heroine of a slasher film the more outwardly tough and aggressive type.
At least I know who I am.
Horror, after all, hinges a lot of its tension on our fear that a character can survive whatever. It's why a shyer or more delicate female makes for a compelling final girl.
I'll kill you if this is a joke.
Laurie contrasting with Annie and Jess contrasting with Barb. That's one of the reasons audiences find Helen more compelling than Julie in I Know What You Did Last Summer.
What happened between us? We used to be best friends.
Helen is softer and fragile enough that you fear for her survival, but capable enough that you hope for it too. Julie, meanwhile, already seems like a tough chick who doesn't take anything from anyone, so there's less tension when she's facing off with the killer. The strength of the Scream films is in how Sidney begins the story as this fragile ingenue, but finds that inner strength as she fights back, culminating in the oh-so-satisfying third act table turn where she outsmarts the killers.
Did you really call the police?
You're sorry, Isaac.
So Fear Street took a risk on making its main heroine the aggressive, independent type who can very obviously take care of herself. And it absolutely worked because Dina is awesome.
The bitch seemed normal.
Yeah, well, I hate to break it to you, but normal bitches don't bleed black fucking blood.
Kiana Madeira is great at not just anchoring the whole trilogy, but on the reverse of how Neve Campbell brought lots of strength to Sidney, she brings plenty of softness to Dina.
It's not really easy for me to, be like us.
This character could have been a whiny annoyance like Chris of Black Christmas 2019, but you never feel as though you don't understand where Dina's coming from, and even in scenes where she's being mean or aloof, you can still feel the character's virtues.
Stop being mad at me for wanting a different future. It's not your future if you're pretending to be someone else.
And this kind of character is a spot-on portrayal of a Gen X teen who had lived through the AIDS epidemic, crime reaching its peak, and being constantly told that there would be no jobs in the future.
Jesus, you're doing it again. Doing what? Welcome to the suck. Shit is doomed. Shit is doomed.
This character's apathy for everything highlights the cynicism of the 90s in a startlingly realistic way. And likewise with how Kate and Simon cynically deal drugs in the hopes of making money to escape Shadyside. Or Josh's obsession with real-world serial killers.
Why didn't I see this on the news?
Because it happened 30 years ago.
It's almost too coincidental that the first film in the trilogy, released during an especially uncertain time in the world, would highlight how humanity has struggled through difficult periods in the past, even without a witch's curse and undead serial killers. And unlike Black Christmas 2019 and The Craft Legacy, another refreshing part of Fear Street is that it focuses on telling a good story first, and trusts the audience to pick up on its messages for themselves.
You make me feel like me.
And I hate having to constantly reference Captain Marvel, but Fear Street's use of both the 90s setting and its characterization show just how much more successful it was in that regard. Captain Marvel was so steeped in 90s Riot Girl music on the soundtrack to create an empowering feminist vibe, and yet rather than drawing inspiration from those musicians themselves and how they redefined what it could mean to be a woman, the result is a complete cipher who doesn't know who she is, and only finds out she's a generic 2010s strong female character. Horror films already have a leg up on this particular epidemic since, as mentioned before, you need tension that the character might not survive an encounter with a monster or serial killer. But Fear Street's women managed the impossible and create four-dimensional characters that can be strong in both a personality and character sense.
I mean, here we are. We're together for one night and dead people are trying to kill us.
I especially have to highlight Sam, who is not only a fun subversion of the typical girl next door, but is notable for spending 80% of her screen time as a damsel in distress. And you know what? Ain't nothing wrong with being in distress and needing help from other people, because you know what? That's life. And demonizing not being able to save yourself all the time isn't going to help anyone in the long run.
Are you giving me a pass? No.
Granted, a character that just needs to be saved all the time can get annoying, but Sam is a good example of creating that feeling where you want her to survive and be saved, which is all the more effective when it's a genre where that's the main tension.
Finish it.
And a plot being driven by the need to save a queer woman's life gets a big thumbs up from me. Benjamin Lee has this to say on the performances overall. An ensemble film made up of largely unknown young actors is as dicey as the entire endeavour itself, but what's most remarkable about Fear Street is just how excellent each and every cast member is, adding genuine weight to the drama. Watching them all interact recalls that unusual joy we also felt while watching Scream or The Faculty or The Breakfast Club, of young, untested actors instantly and enthusiastically proving their worth, names to be remembered for future reference, with real disappointment when their bodies start to pile up. Film's MVP is arguably casting director Carmen Cuba. And guys, world building.
It happens in Shadyside over and over. Normal people turn into psychos.
It's safe to say that, with it being one of the only epic horror novels in the mainstream, this genre doesn't see a lot in terms of in-universe mythology, especially slashers. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, since my favourite slashers boil down to just surviving a mysterious killer.
It's me, Billy.
They're simple and to the point, so they don't need more than that. But that doesn't mean a franchise that wants to introduce other elements isn't extremely welcome if it works. And it does here.
Fine, let's assume that the witch has been possessing people for some sort of messed up vendetta.
What I'll always love about this trilogy is that it's light on the exposition, and plonks you right in the middle of the action, without taking too much time to hold your hand as it explains absolutely everything for the crowd with their claws out ready to complain about plot holes.
It's Jaws, dude! A shark smelling blood!
We're given little pieces of the mythology, and encouraged to figure things out as we go, without leaving too much vague either.
A razor? Yeah, for like old-timey shaving, or in this case, I guess, slitting her wrist.
Ruby Lane, for example.
She slashed her wrist.
We know just enough of her backstory to make her feel like a fully formed presence in the story, with the details excitingly left up to our imagination.
She's saying that she murdered her boyfriend, her friends, and then she killed herself.
There's a rich mythology to draw on for future installments, because we know there's going to be more at some point, and what we're already given doesn't feel wasted.
Shadyside isn't just some hotbed for psychos. All these massacres are connected to Sarah Fear.
It's still pretty unusual to see a horror franchise being given this kind of grand treatment normally reserved for superhero movies and television, but I'm here for it.
Henchman? As in every one of those sickos on your wall is going to be coming after us?
So, I've talked about how this works as a story, but how does it work as a horror? I do have to note that the original Fear Street books were basically murder mysteries aimed at 12 to 14-year-olds, so they were about on the level of violence that I Know What You Did Last Summer reaches. But Lee Janiak says...
And in my memory, they were very edgy, very subversive, very kind of like, and it's funny, so I just have this memory of them being on the edge, and so that's why it made sense to me to have the movies push it.
And even though the 90s were tamer than the early days of slashers, they could still have this gore, and in 1994 it's used in the same way as in Scream, feeling like there's several bombs going off at once to heighten the tension. The movie also subtly tricks the audience with its use of plot armor, making us focus so much on Sam's potential survival that we neglect to worry about everyone else. And then... Not only is this something memorable, but it's a good demonstration of how to use character deaths to amplify the tension, rather than just, oh well, haven't had one in a while, down you go, Kate. Maybe taking cues from that other famously heartbreaking death in a 1994 film. The subsequent death of Simon really ratchets that tension even further, so that even when I've seen this I don't know how many times, it still feels like this is going to be the time it doesn't work. And of course they have to give us that classic RL Stine twist ending to entice us for more.
We ended it. We stopped the killers.
But you haven't stopped her. You can't. She makes the rules.
1994 was probably my least favourite film in the trilogy, which does in no means discount its quality.
Come back from that, motherfuckers!
Actually, on the most recent rewatch, I found myself enjoying it more than ever.
It was barely first base.
I can appreciate the visual flair for sure. Talking to other people who actually were teens during that period confirms how well it represented its setting.
Do not eat these. These will make your little heart stop, and you'll choke to death on your own vomit, and everyone will be so super sad.
I have a real love for how it tells its story in a way that trusts the audience to keep up and figure things out along the way. And as a horror, it delivers in both suspense and in that one memorable death we all watch a slasher for. But unlike the end of 1994, the end of this video will not be a twist. Because you know that there are 2 sequels to unpack, and I assure you, the best is yet to come.
See you tomorrow?
No.
See you tonight.